I spent 42 years of my life building kingdom halls for free, believing that every brick laid was a brick on my path to paradise. My calloused hands erected 17 buildings in 7 different states, from the suffocating heat of Texas to the biting cold of Michigan. I never received a dime. I never asked. The organization said it was a privilege to serve Jehovah this way, that blessings would come in the form of eternal life, not dirty money from this condemned system of things. I believed it with every fiber of my being. Today, at 70 years old, with arthritis that turns every movement into agony and a pension that barely covers my medication, I discovered something that shattered everything I had built inside myself. The halls I raised with my own hands were sold, one after the other, for amounts that would make any real estate developer drool with envy. The money was not used to help widows like my wife after she died of cancer without proper treatment because the organization discouraged certain medical procedures. It wasn't used to bail out the elderly who dedicated their entire lives preaching from door to door until their legs gave out. The money simply vanished into the coffers of a multibillion-dollar corporation controlled by 8 men in New York who never once soiled their hands with cement. My name is Walter Davies. I was born into a Jehovah's Witness family in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1955. I didn't have a choice about joining this religion, but I did have a choice about finally seeing the truth. And that truth has numbers, it has documents, it has evidence that not even 40 years of indoctrination can erase from my mind. This is the story of how I discovered that my faith, my work, and my life were fuel for a money-making machine disguised as a religion. They called it theocratic work. I call it what it truly was: systematized exploitation in the name of God. Before I start telling you how I got here, I need you to understand one thing about being a Jehovah's Witness for 4 decades. It's not just going to meetings 3 times a week or knocking on doors on Saturday mornings. It's waking up every day inside a hermetically sealed bubble where every thought, every decision, every relationship is filtered through what 8 men in Brooklyn, now in Warwick, say Jehovah wants from you. It's living with the constant burden of never being good enough, of never doing enough, while Armageddon hangs over your head like a guillotine that could fall at any moment. My not questioning anything all those years doesn't mean I was stupid. It means I was afraid. Afraid of losing my entire family through disfellowshipping. Afraid of losing my eternal salvation. Afraid of finding out that everything I sacrificed my youth, my marriage, my health for was a monumental lie. Fear is the glue that keeps 8 million people trapped in this system, and I was glued with the strongest glue there is, the glue of being born into it. But something happens when you reach 70 and realize you have more past than future. Priorities change. The fear of death lessens when you're already looking at it closely every day. And the need to die with a clear conscience, to tell the truth before it's too late, outweighs the terror of being labeled an apostate and treated as dead while alive by everyone you know. That's why I'm here telling this story. Not to destroy anyone's faith in God, but to expose what I saw, what I lived through, what I discovered about an organization that uses God's name to enrich 6 men while millions of faithful live in poverty because they followed the very organization's advice not to pursue higher education, to work part-time to preach more, to donate every last penny to the worldwide work while they themselves go without. If this story has reached you, leave a comment telling me what city you are watching from. Give a like if you think stories like mine need to be told. And subscribe to the channel because this is just the first layer of an onion that, when you finish peeling it, only leaves tears. Many tears. My father was baptized as a Jehovah's Witness in 1952, 3 years before I was born. He had been a Methodist, one of those who went to church on Sundays more out of social tradition than real conviction, until 2 ladies knocked on our door with colorful magazines talking about a paradise on earth where lions would eat straw alongside oxen and children would play with snakes safely. My mother, pregnant with me at the time, was enchanted by those images. They started a Bible study that same week. I grew up going to meetings at the Kingdom Hall before I even knew how to tie my own shoes. My first memories are of sitting in those hard chairs for 2 hours, 3 times a week, listening to discourses about prophecies I never fully understood but which always ended with the same warning. The end is near, Armageddon is coming, only those serving Jehovah within the organization will survive. I learned to read using the Watchtower publications. I learned math by counting the hours of preaching on the monthly report card that every publisher was required to hand in to the elders. When I was 10 in 1965, the organization published a book that completely changed the life of our congregation. The title was pompous, as they always were, something about eternal life in the freedom of the sons of God. But what really mattered was buried in the central pages. The strong suggestion that Armageddon would come in 1975, calculated through biblical chronologies that supposedly proved that 6,000 years of human history would end that year. My father sold the small repair business he had and began preaching full-time as a pioneer. My mother stopped working as a seamstress. We lived off odd jobs and the generosity of non-witness relatives whom my father despised for being part of Satan's world, but from whom he did not hesitate to accept financial help. The 1975 fever infected the entire congregation like a spiritual disease. Families sold houses, young people canceled college plans, couples postponed having children because why bring children into a world that was less than a decade from its end? I was 20 in 1975. I was engaged to a girl from the neighboring congregation, Annie Pratt, daughter of an elder who had been preaching since the 40s. We canceled the honeymoon we had planned to Canada because it seemed frivolous to spend money on tourism when we could use those resources to preach more before the end. We got married in a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall. No party, no waste, because the end was so near that any extravagance seemed like an insult to Jehovah. 1975 arrived and passed. Armageddon did not come. The organization's explanations were vague, subtly changing what had been said, blaming members for having wrong expectations even though it was the Watchtower articles themselves that had created those expectations. Many left the organization, disappointed. Some even committed suicide after having destroyed their lives for a false prophecy. But most, like me, simply swallowed the disappointment, rationalized the mistake as ours and not theirs, and kept moving forward because leaving would mean admitting that all that pain had been in vain. It was around this time, right after the 1975 failure, that they began pressuring the brothers for voluntary construction work. The organization was expanding rapidly, building kingdom halls and assembly halls all over the country. They needed labor, a lot of labor, but had no intention of paying for it. The solution was brilliant in its perversity. Turn heavy manual labor into a spiritual privilege. If you were chosen to work on a theocratic construction project, it was because Jehovah saw something special in you, because you were worthy of serving in a more direct way. And who would refuse a privilege given by God? I didn't refuse. I was 22, strong as an ox, and desperate to prove that my faith had not been shaken by the 1975 disappointment. When the elder invited me to participate in the construction of a new Kingdom Hall in Montgomery, 2 hours from Birmingham, I immediately accepted. Annie didn't like it. We were newly married. She wanted me to focus on building our life, maybe start thinking about having children despite the recent disappointment. But I convinced her that it was temporary, just a few weeks, and that the blessings we would receive would compensate for the sacrifice. A few weeks turned into a few months. A few months turned into years. A few years turned into decades. And the blessings I expected never came in the way I imagined. But the money flowed into the organization's coffers like a turbulent river that never stopped running. The first construction project I worked on was a revelation of how the system operated. We arrived at the Montgomery site on a Monday morning, about 40 brothers from various congregations in Alabama and neighboring states. There were electricians, plumbers, carpenters, masons, all qualified professionals in their fields, all willing to work for free because they had been convinced it was sacred service. The construction superintendent was a brother from New York, sent by World Headquarters, who had experience managing construction but treated everyone as if we were employees of a company and he was the boss who paid our wages. We woke up at 5 in the morning, did our personal devotions reading the day's text from the Watchtower, had a quick breakfast prepared by the sisters who had also come to cook and clean for free, and were on the site at 6 sharp. We worked until noon, a 1-hour lunch break, then 5 more hours of heavy labor under the scorching Alabama sun. We had dinner at 6, had an improvised congregation meeting at 7, and collapsed into beds borrowed from local brothers at 9 at night, too exhausted even to pray properly. The schedule was tight, no days off, no rest on Sundays because Sundays were exactly when more volunteers showed up since they didn't have to miss their secular work. We worked 7 days a week for 6 consecutive weeks. My personal quota of preaching hours dropped drastically because there simply wasn't time, but the elders assured me that construction work counted as indirect preaching. After all, we were building a place from which the good news would be preached for decades. What truly impressed me was the quality of the work they demanded. It wasn't a shoddy construction. Everything was done to very high professional standards because the organization knew, although they never said it openly, that those buildings would have significant market value. We used good materials, not the best because that would be a waste of donated money, but good enough for the building to last and appreciate in value. Every detail was supervised, every corner checked, because representatives from headquarters would show up without notice to inspect the progress. We finished that Kingdom Hall in record time. At the dedication, the branch representatives' talk emphasized how much Jehovah had blessed the project, how the brothers' dedication had resulted in that beautiful place of worship, how it proved we had divine support. They applauded the superintendents, the local elders, the coordinators. No one applauded the 40 men who had sweated blood for 6 weeks. But it didn't matter. Our reward was in heaven. We didn't need human recognition. At least that's what we were told. 3 months later, I received another invitation. This time for an assembly hall in Atlanta, a bigger project. It would require 3 months of work. Annie was pregnant with our first child. She begged me not to go, said she needed me there, that the pregnancy was difficult, that the morning sickness wouldn't stop. I talked to the elders of my congregation. They were clear. Family is important, but Jehovah's work comes first. Annie needed to learn to be a submissive wife who supported her husband in his theocratic service. And besides, there were many sisters in the congregation who could help her during my absence. I went to Atlanta. I worked throughout Annie's pregnancy. I returned 2 weeks before the birth, just enough time to be there when my son was born, but not enough time to have truly accompanied those 9 crucial months. Our son came with complications, needed to stay in the neonatal ICU for 2 weeks. The medical bills were astronomical. I asked the organization for help. After all, I had just spent 3 months working for them for free. Surely there would be some assistance fund. The answer was polite but firm. The organization had no responsibility for the personal choices of the brothers. Medical expenses were my responsibility, and if I was in financial difficulties because I had taken time off secular work to serve in construction, that demonstrated a lack of planning on my part. That hurt more than any physical injury I had sustained on the construction sites. But I swallowed that too. I rationalized that maybe they were right, that I should have planned better, that I couldn't expect the organization to solve my personal problems. I took out a loan from non-witness relatives, the same ones my father despised, and spent the next 5 years paying off those debts while continuing to accept invitations to work on theocratic construction whenever they called. Annie never complained openly, but I saw a sadness in her eyes that wasn't there when we got married. I saw it when she looked at other families where the husbands were present, participated in raising the children, had dinner at home every night. I saw it when our son asked why Daddy traveled so much, why Daddy couldn't go to his school baseball game, why Daddy wasn't at the Christmas presentation. Sorry, there were no Christmas presentations because witnesses didn't celebrate Christmas, but there were school presentations that I also missed. The pattern was established. Part-time secular work to pay the basic bills, door-to-door preaching to keep my hours up and not be seen as spiritually weak, theocratic construction whenever requested because it was impossible to refuse without seeming like you were putting your personal needs above Jehovah's needs. And in the middle of all this, a family I barely knew, a marriage that was dying of emotional starvation, and an exhaustion that penetrated to the bones and never really left. But I continued, because stopping would mean admitting I was wrong. And I couldn't be wrong. My entire life was built on the premise that the organization spoke for God. And if that were a lie, then everything was a lie, and there was nothing worse than living in a meaningless universe after having sacrificed everything for a meaning that didn't exist. It was in 1987, at 32, that I began to notice certain patterns that didn't make sense within the narrative they sold us. I had already worked on 7 different construction projects, from small kingdom halls to an assembly hall complex that accommodated 3,000 people. Each project was presented as urgently necessary, each one as proof of the organization's blessed growth, each one as an investment in the future of the preaching work. But then I started seeing halls being sold. The first one I noticed was the one in Montgomery, the first one I had worked on. Just 12 years after construction, the organization decided there was a need to consolidate congregations, that it was more efficient to have a larger congregation in one larger hall than two smaller congregations in two smaller halls. The explanation made sense on the surface. It was about resource optimization. But the Montgomery Hall was sold to a Baptist church for an amount that, according to rumors, exceeded $200,000. It was 1987. $200,000 was a lot of money, especially considering that the construction cost had been practically zero in terms of labor. I asked an elder what would happen to that money. He told me, with that condescending little smile elders use when they think you're questioning theocracy, that the money went to the organization's worldwide fund, would be used in poor countries in areas where there was a real need for growth. It seemed fair. I accepted it. But then I saw the second hall being sold, and the third, and I realized there was a pattern. The organization was systematically building kingdom halls in areas that were appreciating in value, using volunteer labor, waiting a few years while the real estate market went up, then consolidating congregations and selling the properties for values far exceeding the cost of materials. It was brilliant in its simplicity. It was immoral in its execution. And it was completely invisible to the 8 million faithful who continued to donate money and labor believing that everything was for Jehovah's glory. That same year, 1987, the organization launched a new initiative called the Kingdom Hall Assistance Arrangement, a plan to help poor congregations build their halls. The idea was that richer congregations would donate to a central fund, and this money would be loaned, theoretically interest-free, to congregations that needed to build. The loans would be paid back over the years, and then that money would be loaned again to other congregations. On paper, it looked like pure Christian charity. In practice, it was an unprecedented real estate accumulation scheme. The central organization controlled all property titles, even if the local congregation had donated the land and paid for the construction. If a congregation couldn't pay the loan, the hall was not lost to the bank as it would be with any other debtor. It was simply completely absorbed by the central organization. And when halls were sold, the money did not return to the congregation that had contributed. It went straight to Warwick. I started doing mental calculations. If each kingdom hall I had helped build was worth an average of $200,000, and I had worked on 7 up to that point, my free labor had generated at least $1,400,000 in real estate assets for the organization. And I was just one of thousands of volunteers doing the same work around the world. The numbers were stratospheric when you really stopped to think. But I didn't stop to think. Not completely, because thinking meant questioning. And questioning was the first step to apostasy. And apostasy meant losing everything. Family, friends, community, eternal salvation. The cost of questioning was too high, so I pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind, where they silently fermented while I continued carrying bricks under the sun. Annie finally broke in 1989. Not dramatically, not with shouts or accusations. She simply said one morning, as I packed my bag for another 3-month construction project in Tennessee, that she didn't know if she loved me anymore, that she had married me expecting a companion, a father for her children, a life partner, but what she had was a tenant who showed up occasionally, slept in her bed when he was home, but whose real life was happening on construction sites hundreds of miles away. I canceled that trip. It was the first and only time I refused an invitation for theocratic construction. The elders were not happy. They insinuated that I was being controlled by my wife, that I was putting carnal desires above spiritual responsibilities. But I stood firm. I spent the next 6 months trying to salvage my marriage, really getting to know my 2 children, being a present father for the first time in their short lives. It was the best period we had as a family. We had dinner together every night. I helped with homework. Annie and I talked for real, not just functional exchanges about bills and responsibilities. We rediscovered why we had fallen in love 15 years earlier, before the organization consumed everything. But then the pressure came. Subtle at first, brothers asking if I was okay, if there were problems they could help solve, why I wasn't participating in construction anymore. Then less subtle, elders scheduling pastoral meetings where they pointed out that my example was weakening the congregation, that young people might see my absence as an excuse not to volunteer, that I had a responsibility to my brothers in faith. And finally, the bomb. I was removed from my position as a ministerial servant. The official justification was vague, something about needing time to take care of family matters, but everyone understood the real message. I had displeased the hierarchy, and there were consequences. Annie was devastated, not by the loss of status, although that also hurt in an organization where your social position is directly linked to your theocratic assignments, but because she knew I couldn't stand living as someone marked, someone who had fallen from spiritual favor. She was right. 3 months later, I was back on the construction sites, carrying the guilt of having disappointed Jehovah, trying to regain what I had lost through hard work and unquestioning submission. Annie said nothing when I packed my bag. She just looked at me with that deep sadness I knew so well, kissed my forehead, and went back to the kitchen where she was preparing breakfast for our children. That was the last normal morning we had as a family, because what came next changed everything in ways none of us could have foreseen. The 90s were a decade of brutal expansion for the organization. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening of Eastern European countries, there was fertile ground for growth in nations that had been closed for decades. The organization pumped resources into these areas, building halls, printing literature, sending missionaries. And where did the resources come from? The volunteer work of thousands of men like me who had families to support but were constantly reminded that storing treasures on earth was futile, that true wealth was in heaven. I worked on 11 construction projects during the 90s. My body started complaining in ways I could no longer ignore. By 40, my back hurt constantly. By 45, I needed to take painkillers before starting the workday. But complaining was weakness. It demonstrated a lack of faith that Jehovah would provide strength. I saw men older than me working until they dropped, literally collapsing on construction sites and being carried away by younger brothers while someone ran to call an ambulance. And here's something they never talk about openly but everyone knows. There was no insurance. We worked on professional construction with heavy equipment at heights with dangerous tools, but there was no coverage if something happened. The organization had excellent lawyers who had structured everything so that technically we were not employees, we were religious volunteers, so there was no labor responsibility. If you got hurt, it was your problem. Your medical bills were yours. Your recovery was your responsibility. I saw a brother fall from a 10-foot scaffolding on a construction site in Louisiana. He fractured his spine. He became paraplegic. The organization sent flowers to the hospital. Prayers were said on his behalf at meetings, but financially he was alone. He had to sell his house to pay the medical bills. His wife had to work 3 jobs to support the family. And when he became depressed, bitter, started questioning why he had risked everything for an organization that abandoned him in his hour of need, he was disfellowshipped for apostasy. That terrified me more than any accident could. Not the accident itself, but seeing how quickly someone who had dedicated decades to the organization could be discarded the moment they became inconvenient or questioning. It was a visceral reminder that loyalty flowed only in one direction, from bottom to top, never from top to bottom. Annie died in 2003. Breast cancer that was diagnosed too late because she ignored the symptoms for months, didn't want to bother, didn't want to spend money we didn't have on doctors. When she finally went, it had already metastasized. The doctors recommended aggressive treatment, chemotherapy, radiation, surgery. But the organization had published articles questioning certain treatments, suggesting that true Christians would rely more on Jehovah than on extreme medical procedures that only prolonged suffering in this condemned system of things. Annie, faithful until the end, chose minimal treatment. Prayer instead of chemotherapy. Faith instead of surgery. She died 6 months after the diagnosis at 48, leaving 2 adult children who barely knew their father because their father was always away building kingdom halls, and a husband who finally realized, too late, the real price of his unquestioning loyalty. The funeral was at the Kingdom Hall, of course. The talk was generic, one of the pre-written discourses by the organization that serve for anyone because they are not really about the person, they are about doctrines and the hope of resurrection. 15 minutes about Annie, a woman who spent 50 years on this earth, reduced to a teaching tool about how good Christians face death. My children left the organization in the years following their mother's death. First the eldest, then the youngest. They were not disfellowshipped. They simply stopped going. Let the faith quietly slip away from their lives like sand between their fingers. I tried to bring them back, pleaded, argued, used every scripture and reasoning I knew. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and frustration, said they loved me but couldn't live a lie anymore, that they had seen what the organization did to our family, to their mother's life, to my life. According to the organization's rules, I should limit my contact with them since they were spiritually inactive. I shouldn't socialize, shouldn't have conversations beyond what was necessary. Needed to keep my distance to protect my spirituality and perhaps make them miss the association and return. But they were my children. Annie was dead. Everything I had sacrificed my life for was crumbling. And I had to choose between my only children or an organization that had taken everything from me and given nothing in return but exhaustion and pain. I chose my children, but the guilt was overwhelming. With every dinner we shared, every conversation we had, I felt I was betraying Jehovah, that I was putting human feelings above divine principles. 5 decades of indoctrination don't disappear because you consciously decide to ignore it. It stays there, whispering, eroding, making you question every moment of happiness because happiness achieved through disobedience cannot be real happiness. I continued working in construction, now more out of habit than conviction. My body was destroyed. I was in my 50s but felt 80. Every movement was pain. Every morning upon waking was a battle against joints that no longer wanted to cooperate. But the work was all I knew. It was my identity. It was how I measured my worth before God and before the community. To stop would be to admit defeat, would be to accept that maybe everything had been in vain. It was during a construction project in 2008, in the midst of the financial crisis, that I had the first major epiphany. We were building a Kingdom Hall in a suburb of Phoenix that was being hit hard by the housing crisis. Houses nearby were being foreclosed, families losing everything, unemployment was sky high. And there we were, building a brand new building while people in the surrounding community were literally losing their roofs. I suggested to the elders, with all the naivety left in me, that maybe we could use our resources to help those families. We could postpone the construction of the hall. The congregation could continue meeting in the old hall, which was still perfectly functional, and use the money and volunteer work to help the needy in the community. Wouldn't that be what Jesus would do, help the poor instead of building temples? The response was quick and sharp. The organization was not a secular charity. Our work was spiritual, not physical. Helping people find the truth was more important than helping them keep their homes in this system of things that was condemned anyway. And besides, who was I to question the organization's decisions? The elders knew better than I did what Jehovah wanted. That planted a seed of doubt that began to grow like a weed in cracked concrete. If we weren't a charitable organization, what exactly were we? If our priority wasn't helping the needy but building real estate properties, how were we different from any corporation seeking to expand its assets? And if the elders always knew better, why had 1975 been such a spectacular failure? Why had so many prophecies failed? Why did policies on organ transplants and blood transfusions change every decade? But I still wasn't ready to face those questions completely. I was 60, most of my life was behind me, and facing that everything had been a mistake was simply impossible at that moment. So I continued building, carrying bricks and doubts in equal measure, hoping that somehow everything would make sense in the end. The internet changed everything. I spent most of my life in an information bubble carefully controlled by the organization. We only read their publications, only listened to their discourses, only associated with their members. Any external information was suspect, probably of satanic origin, definitely dangerous to our faith. We were specifically instructed to avoid ex-witness websites, not to read criticisms of the organization, not to investigate the accusations that occasionally appeared in the media. But my youngest son, Daniel, worked in technology. In 2015, when I was 60, he gave me a tablet as a birthday gift. He said it would be good for me to keep in touch with him and his brother, that we could video call, that I could read the news, keep up with the world. I resisted at first. Technology always seemed complicated and unnecessary. But he insisted, patiently taught me how to use it, and eventually I started exploring. At first I only used it to read the organization's publications that were now available online. But then I started searching for other things, innocent curiosities at first. I wanted to know about the prophecies we had learned, if others interpreted them the same way. I wanted to understand why my children had left, what was on ex-members' sites that was so dangerous. I wasn't planning to apostatize, I was just curious, and curiosity wasn't a sin, it was just a search for knowledge. What I found destroyed 42 years of certainty in a matter of weeks. Financial documents from the organization showing assets in the billions of dollars. Real estate properties sold for astronomical amounts, including 3 of the halls I had personally helped build, each sold for over $500,000. Court cases, hundreds of them, involving child abuse within congregations where elders knew and did not report to authorities because the organization's policy was to deal with sins internally. I read testimonies from ex-members, thousands of them, all telling variations of the same story. Complete dedication, total sacrifice, and then the painful awakening that they had been used. I read about the secret database of pedophiles the organization maintained, refusing to hand it over to authorities even when ordered by courts. I read about doctrinal changes that condemned people to death for refusing medical treatments that years later became a matter of conscience. But what really broke me was discovering the numbers. The Jehovah's Witnesses organization had, according to leaked financial documents and expert analysis, assets exceeding $20 billion. $20 billion. Controlled by 8 men in Warwick, the governing body, who decided how every penny would be spent without being accountable to absolutely anyone. There was no transparency, no independent audit, no way for members to know where the money they donated went or the value of the work they contributed. I did the math again, this time with more information. 42 years of volunteer work on 17 different construction projects. Conservatively estimating 100 hours of work per construction, that was 1,700 hours. As a qualified mason, my work would be worth at least $25 an hour on the market. $42,500 of labor that I had donated for free. And I was just one of millions. If 1 million witnesses contributed work equivalent to mine over the years, we were talking about $40 billion in volunteer labor. Adding the value of the properties built and sold, the cash donations, the investments made with those resources, the numbers reached completely obscene territory. And none of those billions returned to the people who had generated them. Widows living in poverty, elderly people without adequate medical assistance, families destroyed by shunning policies that tore parents from children when someone questioned the organization. I confronted the elders of my congregation. I brought printouts of the financial documents, the court cases, the policies that had changed condemning people to death. I was not hostile, I was not accusatory, I simply showed them and asked, "How do you explain this? How does this align with what Christ taught about caring for the poor and needy? How can we justify billions in assets when there are brothers going hungry?" The response was predictable. I was accused of reading apostate material, of allowing Satan to plant doubts in my mind, of spreading lies that could stumble others. It didn't matter that the documents were real, verifiable, some even published by the organization itself. The problem wasn't the truth of what I was saying, the problem was that I was saying it. Questioning was apostasy. Full stop. I received an ultimatum. Stop talking about these things, burn all the material I had printed, make a public declaration of repentance, or face a judicial committee that would almost certainly result in disfellowshipping. At 65, after giving my entire life to that organization, after sacrificing my marriage, my health, my relationship with my children, I had to choose between complicit silence or expulsion that would isolate me from all the friends I still had left in the congregation. I chose the truth. I was disfellowshipped 3 weeks later in a judicial committee that lasted less than an hour. The elders had already made the decision before I even entered the room. The process was just theater, a necessary formality to maintain the appearance of justice. They didn't even let me present all the evidence I had collected. They said they didn't want to hear apostate propaganda, that my attitude already showed I was beyond recovery. The announcement was made midweek. Walter Davies is no longer a Jehovah's Witness. Simple as that. 65 years of life reduced to a clinical sentence pronounced from the stage, followed by absolute silence while 200 people I had lived with for decades avoided my gaze. Some cried, not for me but for the sadness of seeing someone leave the truth. Most just looked relieved, as if I were a cancer that had finally been removed from the healthy body of the congregation. My children hugged me when I told them. They didn't say I told you so. They didn't rub it in my face that they had left years ago. They just hugged me while I cried, 65 years of certainty collapsing into a sea of doubt and pain. For the first time in decades, I felt I had a real family, not conditioned on obedience to organizational rules but based on real, unconditional human love. Today I am 70. I live in a small apartment maintained by the meager pension I got after years of working only part-time because the organization always discouraged secular careers. My hands shake with arthritis, my back hurts even when I breathe, and I wake up every morning still processing the magnitude of what I lost. Not just the years, not just the health, but the innocence of believing there was a divine plan behind all the suffering. The $20 billion are there, invested in premium real estate, in hedge funds, in carefully diversified portfolios that continue to grow while the 8 men who control them live comfortably in their Warwick facilities, served by volunteers who work for free, convinced they are serving God when in reality they are serving a multi-billion-dollar corporation disguised as a religion. I don't know how many years I have left. Probably not many, considering the state of my body destroyed by decades of uncompensated heavy labor. But I want to die having told this story, having warned others who are still where I was, carrying bricks for an empire that doesn't value them, sacrificing families for promises that will never be fulfilled. If a single person reads this and reconsiders, if a single family is spared the pain mine went through, then maybe my life was not entirely in vain. My children visit me regularly now. I've met my grandchildren, beautiful children who are being raised with the freedom to think, question, live without the constant fear of displeasing an organization that places itself between them and God. It's bitter to know that I arrived at this freedom too late to fully enjoy it, but it's sweet to know that I broke the cycle, that the next generations of my family will not be fuel for this money-making machine. They said it was work for Jehovah. It was $20 billion in profit for 8 men. They said the sacrifices would be rewarded in paradise. The rewards were real estate properties sold for millions while those who built them struggled to pay for medicine. They said questioning was weakness. I discovered that accepting without questioning was the real weakness, the cowardly surrender of your ability to think in exchange for false certainties and empty promises. This is my story. These are my scars. And this is my final act of service. Not to Jehovah, but to the truth, naked, raw, painful like the bricks I carried for 42 years. May it reach those who need to hear it. May it open the eyes that need to be opened. And may it allow me to die knowing that finally, in the twilight of my life, I chose honesty over obedience, truth over doctrine, and humanity over hierarchy.